mountaineering motion nerds. Oh yeah, it's all coming together now. Any kind of landscaping in Cinema 4D is generally done in 5. 1. Basic geometry. 2. Basic lighting. 3. Shading and texturing. 4. Detailing. 5. Environment and volumetrics. And the first thing is, as they say, first, and that is the base geometry. Now we need to pick a scale that we're going to work to, and it can be any scale, but we do need to stick to it. Now our original mountain is coming out of Houdini at 20,000 by 20,000 by 3,800 meters. It's got a bit too many zeros for my taste, so I'm going to make the scale 1/1000th. And that means we need to create a plane, which is 2,000 centimeters by 2,000 centimeters. And the segment I'm going to give it is 512 by 512. And you'll understand why if you watch the previous tutorial on creating an up-res texture. It's looking a little bit flat at the moment, so let's add a displacer to that boy. Oh, there he is. And in the shader, let's load up our height map from Houdini. Now we saved this as packed raster, so we need to filter out the channels we don't want, and you filter with a filter shader. In here we need to go all the way down to gradation curves, enable those, and completely flatten every one of these except for the red channel. So in the green channel, I'll actually load a linear preset and just squash the top one. Now we'll copy that and paste that into the blue channel as well. So now we're only using the red channel, which is our height map. Now let's make this height map the height we want it to be. You can generally do this just by eye. Give it a nice little height that looks about right. Now, I think somewhere around 800 might look good for this, but you can see that we have a couple of issues. Number one, the whole landscape is just sinking into the ground, but that's easily fixed if we just change the type to intensity. And that means that black in our elevation map is 0, and then the brighter it gets, the higher the mountain becomes. Now the second issue that you might be noticing is that it doesn't look quite the way it looked in Houdini. If that's the case with your mountain too, just go into your texture and make sure the color profile is being interpreted correctly. Now that's a lot more like it. Let's just find a nice elevation to use, maybe 900. Alright, so that means we've got our basic geometry okay. I'm going to rename that to volcano because that is what it's going to be. And now we can actually get started with the basic lighting. I'll be doing that in Arnold, so I will swap to an Arnold layout and start by creating the sunlight using a distant light. Now with this being the sun and being infinitely far away, we want to make sure it always looks at the center of our scene. We want the color temperature to be warm, and we want to go into our light details and give it a little bit of an angle, just so that these shadows have a slight bit of softness to them. All right, let's move that boy into a place where we can actually see it. We can name that one Sun. Now let's create the rest of the sky using a sky object. Now this looks shite, but it does get better, so bear with it. We need to change the color from a constant to use a shader network. And then we need to make ourselves a shader network, which we can name Sky, because this is going to be our sky. Now we just need to find some nice references of some nice skies. Here's a few. And then we simply steal them. All we need to do is pick one we like, create a ramp RGB shader, and use the eyedropper to sample that straight into Arnold. When you pick a sky, keep in mind what type of scene you want it to be. What's the look that you're after? So take a look at the weather and the time of day, because that's basically what's going to dictate the lighting. Alright, so now we have a gradient. Thank you for your contribution, Paul. Now we just need to drag that into our sky object as the color, and you should start seeing quite a big difference. It's still quite shite, but that's easily sorted. Just plug another ramp into our ramp and set that type to a vertical ramp. Now we can use that to control how our sky is distributed across the sky. You want to make sure that it's at least somewhat hemispherical, so that your gradient starts just right at the horizon. And this also kind of shifts what time of day it looks like in your scene. One thing I want to do is to add an even darker bit of the sky right at the top. And just squish all of these colors down to right near the horizon. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, that is basically it when it comes to making natural looking outdoor lighting. All you need to think about is the sun and the scattering. Speaking of those two, I think our sun actually needs to be a little bit stronger to compete with the sky here. But then we can actually move on to the Chicka-chicka-Shading. We'll start with the individual materials we're going to use, and then we'll mix those onto the landscape with our terrain maps. First of them all, rocks. They are everywhere on the mountain. So let's create a new Arnold material and then load up our large scale textures that we made in our large scale texture tutorial. We can simply select and drag those in. I'm going to name and range these all, and we'll plug these all into a standard surface shader. Diffuse just goes straight into diffuse color. Roughness, I like to use a range in between, so I can set the exact roughness that I want. The normal map, of course, needs a normal map node. Displacement just goes straight into the displacement output. Now we can apply our rocky material to our rocky mountain. That's looking a little bit too displaced, so let's add a Cinema4D tag to that boy. And set the displacement to something quite low, around 5 or 10 range. And let's also activate the auto bump to get a bit more detail without the cost of geometry. Alright, nice. But even with this large scale texture that we made to be specifically large scale, it's still a bit too small scale. So let's go into our shader network, select all the textures we're using in UV coordinates, and scale those well down. It's going to be smaller than you think. Probably about 8 for this landscape, so it repeats 8 times across the whole thing. And that is looking like a much better scale. Okay, some final tweaks to the shader, and then we're done with the rocks. Essentially just setting the specular slightly lower and setting the IOR to something a bit more rock-like, not as much like glass. If you're wondering what Arnold is warning us about here, is just the padding distance on our displacement. So we could increase that a little bit and hopefully makes it shut up. Alright, now let's go into the forest. Duplicate the rocky texture, call that one forest. And guess what? We're going to make a forest material. Into the shader network we go. Let's delete all these rocky textures. We don't want them, and we don't need them. Instead, let's drag in our forest textures. Let's arrange and name those as well. And then plug them right into our shader, except for displacement, which goes into displacement. Alright, let's add that boy to our mountain. See what we got. Some final tweaks, mostly reducing the specular down quite a bit. Yeah. And then again, scaling the whole set of textures down. Once again, I'll probably set it to repeat 8 times across the landscape. Now we are starting to see a little bit of repetition in the textures. That would have been much worse if we hadn't done the large scale adaptation of the textures, and it's going to go away when we start mixing them anyway. Now we cannot have a lush landscape like this without any water. So let's duplicate our forest material, name it water, apply that to the mountain, and start turning this forest into water. Even Jesus couldn't do that. First of all, scrap all the textures. We don't need them. Reduce the base weight in our shader. Turn the specular up to max. And set the IOR to water, 1.33. And let's also make sure that we scrap the normal map. Otherwise, it's going to make our landscape look funny. Okay, for the diffuse color, that requires a C4D noise. We're going to make that slightly brownish green, like some sort of a river out in a forest. Set the noise type to probably something smooth, like displaced turbulence. Scale that well down, probably something like 20% or less, because this is a massive landscape that it's going to. And plug it straight into our base color. Alright, things are starting to look wet. Now for the roughness and displacement, we need another Cinema4D noise. This one set to FBM, which is a bit rougher and more granular. And again, let's scale that well down. Now for the roughness, we plug that into the range. Set the minimum roughness to be something more than 0, like 0.1. And set the maximum to 0.3. So it's quite glistening still. Now for the displacement, let's add another range. Plug in the noise. And set it to something ridiculously small, because this water is going wild. Minimum should be somewhere around 0.485, maximum 0.49. So it's really a tiny, tiny range just to get some waves right up close on the surface. Alright, let's once again move one layer up on our landscape. And what happens to water when it gets to higher altitudes? It freezes, so we are making snow. Once again, scrap the textures, in this case the noises, and apply to our volcano. Alright, let's shade this proper first. Base weight once again goes up to the max, because snow is famously quite white. Specular, leave that near 1, but set the IOR to something closer to ice, something like 1.3. Alright, for the diffuse, once again, we need a C4D noise shader. Set that one to be a displaced turbulence to keep it quite smooth, and scale it well down. Also, let's set the color to a very vaguely bluish white color. Now we're not quite ready to plug that in yet. We also need a facing ratio node set to invert. Just add a bit of a peach fuzzy looking translucency effect to the snow. Smash that together with a mix node. Weighted slightly in favor to the noise. And then we can plug that straight into the base color. Let's give that thing a look. Great. Now for these speculars here, we need yet another C4D noise shader. Once again set to FBM, and global scale pulled way down. Plug that into our range and give that a wide one. Leave the minimum at 0.1 but set the maximum to something much higher. And maybe, just maybe, we turn down the specular a little bit. Now for the displacement, we want the same type of noise that we have for the diffuse. So another C4D noise, set to displaced turbulence at about 20% scale. Let's give that a different seed and plug that into our range. Now just like with the water, we want to give this a very narrow range as well. Not quite as narrow, but minimum 0.5 and maximum 0.51. is not out of the question. Okay, these are our basic materials. And now we get on with the mixology. Let's make a master mountain mix material that we call mountain. And import the terrain textures that we're using. Now we've got two files that we're using, one for erosion and one for main. Let's drag both of those in. And let's also name them. Now these images, as I mentioned, are packed raster images. So they got different textures in the R, G and B channels. And that looks a little something like this. Now in Arnold, we can split these out using something called a shuffle node. Let's plug that in and see what it does. Now it lets you set any channel to be outputted to any other channel. So for the main texture, we want the elevation maps, which lives in the red channel. We will simply set all of these to use just the red channel. And then we get just the elevation texture. Now let's do that for every other channel. Okay, at this point, you probably want to name these layers. So for the first one, we've got elevation. Second one, we've got slope map. Then we've got sediment, debris, and lastly, water. Your layers are going to depend on the software and the settings that we used when your images were exported. Alright, now it's time to bring in the materials. And for that, we're going to use a material reference. Just do that for each and every one of them, one by one. And we stick these somewhere nicely in our network and add in a layer shader node. Okay, we're ready to get started proper. Layer number one is going to be the stuff that mountains are made of. It's going to be the rock layer. Layer number two is going to be this greenery forest type layer because that grows on top. And now all of these textures are going to give us everything we need to mix between these materials. And we're going to do it mostly with a lot of ramp shaders. First of all, we want to control where this green stuff grows, starting by limiting elevation. So let's make a ramp shader. Plug the elevation map into that. Now with any matte, white is going to mean on, black is going to mean off. So let's put the white point somewhere around maybe 50 and the black point around 85-ish%. So no green stuff is going to grow above this point. Now let's create let's move these out of the way first, and then create a layer RGBA shader. Let's plug this in as layer number one. And this layer node is going to be our entire forest mat. All right, we've limited elevation. Next step is to limit by sediment. Once again, let's make a ramp and plug the sediment map into that. And this is going to allow us to make ravines. This will be layer 2 in our forest mat. And we really want to crush this one quite hard. The white point, again, should be lower than the black point. I'm going to set that to around 2.5%. And the black point, I will set somewhere around 10%. And let's set that layer 2 to multiply on top of layer 1. Just so we get the darkness in there. But we only want these deep sediment ravines to wash away the vegetation above a certain altitude. So once again, we need to use our elevation map and a ramp. Let's plug the elevation map into the ramp. And then use the ramp as the mix property on layer 2. Now we can choose just how far down these ravines are going to go. And I'm going to limit them just to pretty much the tippy top. Finally, we want to limit the vegetation by slope angle. So once again, we create a ramp, plug in the slope map, and plug that in as layer 3 of our forest mat. Now with this, we just need to make sure that if an area is too steep, there's not going to be any vegetation on that area. So let's once again invert and crush this ramp quite a bit. The more black you have in this layer, the rockier your mountain is going to look. So let's set that layer 3 to also multiply on top. Alright, now let's take our layer shader, plug that into beauty, and let's take our forest mat and plug that in to the mix option for layer 2 in our layer shader. You know what? It looks like we've made some actual progress at last. But it also looks like we need a little bit more overall contrast on that forest mat. So once again, ramp to the rescue. Let's plug the entire forest mat into a ramp before that's then used to mix the layers. And let's just crush that one a little bit, just so there's no fadey areas like these ones. Because in real life, things don't quite fade that way. Alright, so that's that for mixing those two materials. Let's add another contestant. and plug the water material into our layer shader for layer number 3. Now our whole shit looks like a dirty, stormy ocean again. Let's actually order all of these nodes so they are in the correct order. Now the water material is actually the easiest one to mix. All we need to do is take the water texture and plug that straight in. Actually, I'm going to plug it through a ramp because of course I am. But other than that, we can plug that straight in to being the mix for layer 3. And instantly we get this quite nice and lakey looking landscape. It's even looking somewhat nice for close-ups. Alright, let's add this final material ingredient to our mountain smoothie. Plug the snow material into layer 4 for our layer shader. Right, suddenly we're in the mid-winter here. And with the snow, we only want it right at the tippity-toppity peak of the mountain. So let's make the mat for that. First thing we're going to do is again to limit the elevation. So let's plug that elevation map into a ramp and only select the very tippity top of the mountain. Nice. Let's make another layer RGB shader and plug that in as layer 1 in that one. And let's name that shader Snow Mat. Let's proceed by limiting the slope again. Once more, another ramp is in order. Plug the slope into that one. And plug the ramp into layer 2 of our snow mat. Now we need the flatter areas to be white, so we need to invert it. But the slightly steeper areas to be black, because that's simply where the snow has, fallen off. And then we set that one to multiply. Finally, let's once again limit the sediment, just like we did for the forest. Add a ramp, plug sediment into that one, and let that one be layer 3 of our snow mat. Invert that one and crush those colors down so that only the deepest and steepest ravines are getting their snow blown out of them. Let's set that layer to also multiply on top. But hold on, because now we're missing the very tippiest of the tippy top right here. That altitude we wouldn't actually have a lake because that would have probably been frozen. So let's add that back in once again using a ramp and the elevation texture. Plug that in to be layer 4 of our snow mat. And very much only select that very tippiest of tippy tops. And then we're actually going to set that layer 4 not to multiply, but to max. So that brings in only the white areas. But we're still avoiding color values above 1, which sometimes can confuse render engines. Okay, now let's plug this whole mat into another ramp for no apparent reason. And finally use that to mix the snow material in our layer shader. Let's see what it looks like. Ah, lovely. Now we've got every layer of material that we kind of want on our mountain. I'll give that snow mat a little bit of extra contrast in the ramp though. And another thing we can do if we want to add a little bit more detail in, say, our rivers, for example, they're looking quite nice, is to plug the snow shader in there, in another layer, take the water and the slope, multiply those on top of each other, create a mat, which just lets us add a little bit of whitewater in our rivers. And I actually think that looks quite nice, especially for some slightly closer shots. So now the shading is done, but we're still missing quite a bit in the details here. And that is because a layer shader doesn't care about displacements. So to get those displacements back in, we're going to need to go through and copy those from the original materials. So let's do that for each and every one. And don't forget to be naming your shit while you do this. And what we want after that is a layer RGB, not a layer shader, but we want to match exactly what we did to the layer shader with our layer RGB. So plug in each one of your displacements into its corresponding layer, and then mix those layers with their corresponding mats. Simply do that for each and every one. Once those are nice and plugged in, just direct the output of that one into Arnold displacement. And then I recommend that you take a moment to enjoy flying around your landscape.
Far, far away on the edge of the world, you are lost out of place, out of time.
Once you've taken a suitable amount of time to just take in the views, let's also mix in the upresser we made in that previous tutorial. Simply drag that boy in, plug him into a mix node, plug the other displacement layers into the other input, and plug them both into the displacement. And you probably want to weight the mix node a little bit in favor of the upresser. Now for that final bit of detail that we probably want, we need to add a few subdivs. This whole volcano is still a 512 by 512 plane. So let's go into our Arnold tag, activate subdivisions. Catmull and Clark is going to give a slightly smoother result, whereas the linear one is going to keep some of those sharp ridges. So which one you choose, it's up to you. Either way, I'm going to set the iterations to probably 2, just to balance a bit of speed with a bit of detail. 3 iterations would be the maximum resolution, because the textures we're using are 4K textures, but I will leave it just at 2. And that concludes the mountain. Would you believe it? This whole mountain is done. The environment, however, is not done. So we need to add some details to this. So let's go find some trees. Here are some that I made off of some trees I found on the internet. I'll link them in the description if I can remember where I found them. And if you look really closely, you will notice that each tree is made up of 2 polygons with an image of a tree on. And that is actually perfect because the distances we're going to be using these at means we're going to need a lot of them. So let's copy those into our scene and stick them all into a cloner. And we're going to clone these trees all up and down that mountain. So we'll set the cloner to object mode. Now before we go and drag our volcano into the object slot for that, let's turn off our cloner first. Just to make sure that it's set to surface and not vertex. Otherwise we'd end up instantly generating about 250,000 trees. But surface distribution seems to be active by default these days. Thanks Maxon. So we can turn it right back on. We've got some wonky trees just lying about the mountainside here. So let's disable the align clone option and make sure that we've got the instance mode set to multi-instance, because we are about to create a whole heckin' bunch of these. I think the minimum count for us to see what we're actually doing is going to be 10,000. Set the viewport mode to just show bounding box so they pop a little bit more, and scale them down to taste. Now this is a very massive landscape, so I'm going to set the scale to something ridiculously small, like 0.3. Okay, so maybe not that ridiculous, but still quite small. Now let's put that cloner into a null Start getting intimate with a shader effector. Now, first of all, let's go into parameter to turn all the options off, especially the color mode, but check visibility. Under effector, let's set the minimum to be 0, maximum to be 100%. And let's create our shader effector material. Standard material this time, with all channels disabled except for luminance. And in luminance, we want to create a layer shader. That's where we're going to make our lovely matte. So let's add that material to our shader effector. Set the shader effector under shading to use the luminance channel. Let's also add our tree matte as a material on our volcano too. And set the viewport settings, textured preview size to something a bit higher, like 1K. Now for this, we're basically going to do the same thing we did for the forest matte. Let's start by limiting the trees so they don't grow in the water. Let's load up an image. Let's import our erosion textures. Add that one to a filter shader. Go into that, enable the gradation curves, and let's set all channels to minimum except for the blue one, because that's where the water lives. Let's stick that whole filter shader into a colorizer and crush that down a little bit. And suddenly, there are no more trees growing in lakes. Definitely a step in the right direction. Okay, now let's limit the elevation so that there are no more trees growing above a certain altitude. For that, we need to import the main textures. Once again, stick that into a filter and get rid of the channels we don't want. And in this case, it is the green channel that we want to set to minimum. Stick that whole filter into a colorizer. And I really want to limit this to grow the trees quite low down in the mountains. So I'm going to set the white point to somewhere around perhaps 17. But then also crank up the black point to somewhere more like 6%. So we're still getting forests a bit lower down, but once you get a bit of altitude, you start getting into Karfjellet. Let's set the elevation limit to add on top of the water one. And let's name these both so we don't mistake one for the other. Finally, let's limit the slope angle as well. So we need to copy and paste the elevation matte. Name that slope. And go into our filter and shift these around. So we want the green one reset to default. Now we want the red one set to minimum. Now let's pop one level up and change the colorizer so that the black point is around maybe 13 and the white point is around 25 perhaps. So now there are simply not going to grow any trees on the very steepest slopes on this landscape. Oh, and of course, let's set the slope matte to also add on top of the other ones. All right, so these are the areas where our trees are going to grow, where we're going to have ourselves a little forest area. Let's add ourselves a little random effector to give some variation to our forest. Turn off the position, but set the scale to about 0.3 or 0.2 in uniform mode. And also set the rotation to something very, very high on the heading. And something very, very low on the pitch and bank. So now they're all pointing in slightly different directions at slightly different sizes. Okay, let's save and crank those trees up. Let's remove this shader from the volcano so we can see the trees a bit better. And let's start cranking. Now I find that about 500,000 trees is generally enough to create nice and thick forests. Now that's going to take a little time to calculate and it's going to be a little slow to work with. But if we temporarily turn that off and find a nice little angle to do a test render from, you can tell that having a little bit of trees there makes a world of difference. Now, it is very slow to work with, so if you find these 500,000 trees too slow to work with, you can always figure out where you're going to put your cameras and do a polygon selection for just those areas. For any type of detail that you're going to add to your mountain, this is the basic gist of it. For any detailed close-up, you're going to want to do this with rocks, grass, shrubs, rabbits and other critters. But that is it for the detailing. The landscape, it's looking pretty good, but it could still be better. See, the real world has something called an atmosphere around it, and we should too. So temporarily, just for speed of working, I will disable the forest. Then we can move around a little bit easier. First of all, let's make a null object and call that one environment. I'm going to stick both the sun and the sky into that, if I can hit it. There we go. Now let's create an Arnold volume. Change that from OpenVDB to just be a plain old box. Now we're going to need to scale that boy up quite a bit, because it needs to cover our entire scene. Okay, seems like it's actually covering the scene now. Yep. And we want to make it a lot flatter on top, so it barely reaches the very tippy top, again, of the mountain, but still covers the entire scene. Maybe that's about right. And there's practically no limit to how wide and deep you can make it. Alright, so somewhere in there our mountain is still hanging out, but now it has a very, very thick atmosphere. So let's make a new Arnold material for that. And I'm going to make a preset material out of the volumes options, and it'll be a standard volume, which I'm going to name Atmo. Let's apply that boy to our freshly made volume, and let's stick that into the environment again and name Atmo. Now, we want this material to be incredibly, incredibly low density. 0.02 is in the range of what we want. Just enough to give it a lot more depth, but without completely covering anything. So this is with the volume on compared to without the volume, which just looks a lot more CG. And we haven't even made the colors proper yet. So let's make the colors proper. Now what color you want your atmosphere is up to you, but generally I find that a bright bluish is a good start. Not too saturated though, because that makes it look quite unrealistic. Unless, of course, that's the sort of thing you want. Maybe you want it very blue. And it is, of course, also perfectly fine in case you want to make the atmosphere just a little bit thicker. If anything, that's going to make the whole scene look like it's a lot bigger. Alright, so that gives us a nice bit of atmosphere. Now the next step is to add some lovely clouds, because that'd be nice, wouldn't it? Step one of that is to make some nice clouds. And I'm going to show you that step separately in its own tutorial soon enough. But for now, I'm just going to import some clouds I made earlier. Alright, here are two nice and flat, yet quite fluffy clouds I made earlier. So let's just copy those across from this scene into our landscape scene. And I'm actually going to save a camera in this position because that's quite a nice view. But our clouds are now in the scene. But they are quite big, quite transparent, and quite dark. So let's stick those in a null of their own. Call that clouds. Let's give them some shading love, shall we? We'll just focus on the one for now. Let's first make a copy of the atmosphere. Name that cloud because it is. And add that to our cloud asset. Now that's going to make it even more transparent. So let's make some tweaks. Now these clouds we want to be quite thick. So I'll set it somewhere between 10 and 20. And with clouds being clouds, they are famously quite white. So let's make the color fully white. And one slightly unusual thing we need to do is actually turn up the anisotropy. Now, I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, but I know that for clouds, it needs to be higher than 0 because the tiny droplets of water are actually quite forward scattering. So I'll set that somewhere between 0.2 and 0.4. But as you can probably see, our cloud, even though the shading is finished, our cloud is very, very dark when it renders. And this is where I have some terrible news. And that is because we need to go into our render settings and actually turn up the indirect volumetric rays. As much as it hurts me to say, for realistic clouds, it is necessary. So anything higher than 0 is going to be massively better. Going to give us a few more bounces of light in those clouds, brighten them well up. But ideally, you just want to set that as high as you can afford with your render times. Because sadly, the more the light bounces around in it, the more realistic your cloud is going to look. And the slower the scene is going to render. Regardless, we've got some clouds now and they are looking quite nice. So let's turn off this IPR for now, apply the cloud material to both our clouds and simply place these or clone them to wherever we want in our landscape. I'll probably choose the cloner option because I can't be bothered to art direct this manually. I'll leave it up to chance. And I think I will mostly try to use them to cover up my severe lack of a horizon. And add some in the foreground for an extra sense of depth. Now technically this concludes our landscape. It has all the elements it needs to make a nice and realistic looking landscape. We can of course add a bunch of tweaks still. We can change the lighting a bit depending on what we want the vibe to be. And we can probably add some nice and wispy clouds up in the sky. It would be nice to add some lower clouds just to add a nice layer of mist around the ground because this looks like it could be a nice evening or morning scene. Actual terrain in the background would be nice, maybe more than just a single big mountain in the foreground. Oh, and an actual subject would also help the image look a bit nicer. Probably an astronaut in the foreground, maybe some remains of an ancient ruined civilization in the mountain. And once I've shown you how to make clouds like these in the next tutorial, I'm also going to show you a quick trick to make any twilight landscape scene probably about 20% more realistic and lifelike. But until that time, thank you for your time, and of course, do stay in motion. If you think these tutorials are in any way the bee's knees, the best way to support them is to tell every frustrated freelancer you know about the Process of Motion course. It's going to teach them business, creative, and management skills that are going to help them ease all their frustrations. The link is in the description.